Mom, you will never touch Dad's beach house. His words pierced me like rusty knives. I never thought the deepest pain would come from the mouths I once fed with my own hands. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for a second, feel like this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe. It will help me to keep unburdening myself. My name is Evelyn Reed. I am 67 years old and I live in Boston, in a house that smells of beeswax and memories no one wants to share with me anymore. My hair, once the color of warm chestnuts like my children's eyes, is now silver like the sterling spoons I inherited from my mother, the ones nobody uses for family dinners anymore. My hands, wrinkled from 4 decades of washing dishes, ironing school uniforms, and drying other people's tears, tremble slightly when I hold the cup of coffee I drink alone each morning. For over 40 years, I dedicated myself to raising, caring for, and supporting a family that today calls me a burden. The routine that consumes me begins at 6 in the morning. I wake before the sun illuminates the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill, where we've lived since Thomas was 10. I prepare the breakfast no one thanks me for: toast with butter and jam, freshly brewed coffee, and hand-squeezed orange juice. The sound of my slippers shuffling across the cold marble floor is the only thing that breaks the silence of a house once filled with children's laughter and after-dinner conversations. My husband, Arthur Harrison, passed away just over a year ago. He was an entrepreneur, owner of a chain of boutique hotels on Cape Cod. As cold as the January wind that blows in from the Atlantic, as calculating as the accountants who managed his finances. He never gave me real love, but he gave me a respectable last name and 2 children, Thomas, 42, and Alyssa, 38. I raised them completely on my own. While he traveled between Boston and New York closing million-dollar deals, sipping scotch with other important men in steakhouses on Newbury Street, I was cleaning up vomit from late-night fevers, drying tears from childhood nightmares, and cooking chicken noodle soup that no one acknowledged but everyone silently devoured. I was the mother who woke at 3 in the morning when they had the chicken pox, the one who memorized their extracurricular schedules, the one who sold my engagement ring to pay for their tennis lessons and swimming classes. I vividly remember the smell of Arthur's expensive cologne when he returned from his business trips. He'd arrive with Italian leather suitcases, impeccable suits, and gifts bought at the airport. Dolls for Alyssa, toy cars for Thomas, and for me, nothing. Absolutely nothing. He wouldn't even ask how the children had been in his absence. He'd head straight to his study, lock the door, and review paperwork until the early hours. The day we buried Arthur, at Mount Auburn Cemetery overlooking the Charles River, I sat alone in the 3rd row of polished wooden pews. Neither Thomas nor Alyssa offered me an arm to walk among the gray marble headstones. The eulogy was beautiful, delivered by a pastor who barely knew my husband, filled with words about an exemplary family man and a pillar of the Boston business community. But they never once mentioned the woman who shared 4 decades with that distant man. After the funeral, at the reception hall just off the Mass Pike, while guests ate catered hors d'oeuvres and drank expensive Cabernet, I overheard Thomas's wife, Monica, whisper in his ear, "You'll have to deal with your mother now. You know how demanding she can be." And he replied with a tight smile, "We'll see what we do with her." That night, alone in our marital bed that smelled of stale aftershave and unwashed sheets, I cried until I had no tears left. I wasn't crying for Arthur. I was crying for the 40 years I had wasted waiting for a love that never came, for the sacrifices no one remembered, for the woman I had been before I became a shadow of others. Exactly 2 months after the burial, the comment that split my soul like an axe splits dry wood arrived. It was a Sunday. We had just finished a roast beef dinner that I had started preparing at 10 that morning, searing the meat, peeling the potatoes, making the gravy from scratch. The dining room table was covered with the embroidered tablecloth my grandmother had given me as a wedding gift, and the good Lenox china shone under the golden light streaming through the bay windows that overlooked the small patio filled with red geraniums. Alyssa, dressed in a black J.Crew pantsuit that gave her a corporate air she didn't possess, was flipping through inheritance papers with the focus of a lawyer. Her nails, perfectly painted crimson red, made an irritating tapping sound against the paper as she turned the pages. "Mom," she said without looking up. The beach house isn't for you. It was Dad's. You never really wanted it. You weren't even happy there. My fork fell from my hand. The metallic clatter against the ceramic plate echoed like a gong in my ears. Exactly, Thomas added, wiping his lips with the white linen napkin I had ironed that very morning. He built it with his money, his hard work. Besides, it makes no sense for you to go alone to a place that's just full of memories of him and of US. That house is emotionally ours. Don't you get it? As he spoke, he looked at me with a subtle but perceptible disgust, as if I were a fly that had landed in his glass of Sauvignon Blanc. I felt nauseous. Literally. A wave of acid rose from my stomach to my throat. I staggered up from the table, my bare feet on the cold tile of the kitchen floor, and threw up in the stainless steel sink where I had washed thousands of dishes over my lifetime. It wasn't a physical illness. It was pure, concentrated pain, distilled into bitter bile. The beach house in Chatham. The place where I'd spent every summer for 20 years, where I'd taught my children to swim in the crisp Atlantic waters, where I'd prepared hundreds of dinners while they played in the sand, and Arthur read the Wall Street Journal under a blue beach umbrella. Now they were telling me it had never been mine, that I had never belonged, that my presence there had been tolerated. The cold water from the faucet ran over my trembling hands as I rinsed my mouth. In the distorted reflection of the steel sink, I saw an old tired woman with deep circles under her eyes and wrinkles that told stories of unacknowledged sacrifices. I wondered if I had ever been young, if I had ever had dreams of my own beyond being the perfect American wife and mother. Behind me, Thomas and Alyssa continued talking as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just driven a dagger into the chest of the woman who gave them life. The following weeks were a silent nightmare unfolding in slow motion, like one of those psychological thrillers where the horror comes not from monsters, but from the everyday cruelty of the people who are supposed to love you. I'd get cold, impersonal text messages, written with the same courtesy they'd use with a cleaning service. "We need your signature for the bank," Thomas would write at 11 at night. "The notary is coming tomorrow at 3. Try to be presentable," Alyssa would add with that condescension she had perfected since marrying her lawyer husband in Back Bay. They treated me like a bureaucratic errand, an administrative hurdle to be cleared before they could get on with their prosperous, successful lives. But it hadn't always been like this. For entire nights, lying in that marital bed that now felt like a coffin of starched sheets, I relived every sacrifice I had made for them, every penny I had counted, every tear I had dried with my own hands. I remembered when Thomas was 12 and developed an unhealthy obsession with playing tennis. Lessons at the Longwood Cricket Club cost $300 a month, a fortune for my homemaker's budget, which depended entirely on the household expenses money Arthur gave me each month. I sold my engagement ring, a diamond solitaire my mother had saved for years to give me on my wedding day. I took it to a pawn shop just off Mass Ave, where a man with a graying beard offered me half its real value. "Times are tough, ma'am," he said, examining the stone with a jeweler's loupe. "Diamonds aren't worth what they used to be." He was lying, but I needed the money urgently. Thomas had come home crying because his classmates were making fun of him for not having his own racket. "Mom, everyone has professional gear except me. I'm embarrassed to go to lessons." His eyes, still innocent then, filled with genuine tears that broke my heart. I paid for 6 months of lessons in advance. I bought the racket, the balls, the athletic clothes with the club's embroidered logo. Thomas hugged me that afternoon with a strength that made me forget the sacrifice. "You're the best mom in the world," he whispered in my ear. "When I'm older and make a lot of money, I'm going to buy you all the rings you want." He never kept that promise. In fact, when he quit tennis 2 years later because it wasn't motivating him anymore, he didn't even remember that I had sold my ring to pay for it. Alyssa was worse. At 17, she developed a sudden passion for artistic photography. She needed a professional Canon camera that cost $3,000. Arthur flatly refused. "Rich girls' hobbies are not a priority in this house," he declared from his leather armchair while reading the Wall Street Journal. I secretly worked for 6 months cleaning houses in Chestnut Hill on the weekends. I'd get up at 5 in the morning on Saturdays and Sundays, take the T to the mansions where wealthy families needed someone to scrub their marble floors and clean their travertine marble bathrooms. My knees bled under cheap nylon stockings. My hands cracked from the chemical cleaners I used to make their windows shine like mirrors. I saved every bill in an old Pepperidge Farm cookie tin hidden behind the cleaning supplies in the laundry room closet that no one else ever opened. When I finally had enough money, I gave it to Alyssa one December afternoon, wrapped in gold gift paper. She opened the box, saw the new camera, and screamed with joy. She hugged me so tightly I could smell her chamomile shampoo and the sweet perfume she had started wearing to impress boys at school. "Mom, I can't believe Dad changed his mind. This is amazing." I never told her the truth. I never explained that her father hadn't changed his mind, that the camera had cost 6 months of ruined knees and bleeding hands. I let her believe Arthur had been generous, that her father loved her enough to spend $3,000 on her artistic dreams. 5 years later, when Alyssa married David in a ceremony at the Boston Four Seasons, I found that same camera at a flea market in Cambridge, being sold for $50 among old junk and forgotten objects. She had sold it without telling me, probably to buy something more relevant for her new life as a married woman. But the financial sacrifices weren't the only ones. There were also the sleepless nights when they had fevers, the long days in hospital waiting rooms when they broke bones playing, the hours spent helping with homework I barely understood because I had dropped out of college at 19 to get married. I vividly remembered the night Thomas came home drunk at 20 after a college party near Fenway. It was 4 in the morning and he threw up all over the building's marble staircase. The neighbors complained to the superintendent, threatening to call the condo association. I went down with a mop, industrial strength cleaner, and infinite patience, cleaning every stain while he slept it off in his bed. The next morning, when he woke up with a hangover, I made him a full breakfast. A cheese omelet, toast, coffee with milk, aspirin, and a large glass of water. He ate it all without a single word of thanks. When he finished, he simply stood up and said, "Next time, don't wait up for me. You smother me when you act like an overprotective mother." It hurt more than a slap. I also remembered the thousands of dinners I prepared when they brought friends home. Clam bakes for 12 people, chilled cucumber soup in the summer, hearty beef stew in the winter, elaborate appetizers that took me hours to prepare. I served, cleaned, cleared, and washed, while they had fun, laughed, and talked about their future plans as if I were invisible. Their friends always treated me with superficial respect. "Mrs. Harrison, the food is amazing," they'd say as I cleared dirty plates and refilled wine glasses. But they never invited me to sit with them, never asked my opinion on their conversations, never included me as a real person instead of free domestic help. And when my first grandson Aiden was born, Thomas's son, I became a full-time unpaid nanny. Monica worked as a graphic designer at an ad agency on Newberry Street, and Thomas ran a human resources consultancy. They both had impossible schedules and very demanding careers. "Mom, we need you to take care of the baby on Tuesdays and Thursdays," Thomas announced one afternoon, as if he were assigning me a work task. "Monica has important meetings and I have clients. You have free time. Our free time." As if my 64 years were an empty parenthesis waiting to be filled with the responsibilities they didn't want to assume. I took care of Aiden for 3 years. I changed his diapers, gave him bottles at 3 in the morning when he stayed over, taught him to walk by holding his little hands as he took his first clumsy steps down the apartment hallway. I sang him lullabies I remembered from when they were babies, the same melodies I had hummed 4 decades earlier. When Aiden turned 4, Thomas and Monica decided he was old enough for a private preschool. They informed me via text message, "Mom, starting Monday, Aiden is going to the Montessori school in Brookline. We don't need you to watch him anymore. Thanks for everything. Thanks for everything." As if 3 years of my life were a casual favor they could acknowledge with 2 lines of text. They never asked me to watch their other children when they were born. Apparently, by then they could afford professional nannies who charged by the hour and had proper employment contracts. I had been the free emergency service, the temporary solution until their financial situations improved enough to hire real help. Now, as I replayed each of these memories in the loneliness of my bedroom, I realized I had been systematically used for decades, not as a mother, but as an available resource. Not as a person with her own needs, but as a solution to other people's problems. And the most painful part was that I had willingly participated in my own emotional exploitation, convinced that this was motherly love, that sacrificing without limits was the definition of being a good American mother. The months following that conversation about the beach house became a slow agony of daily humiliations that eroded my soul like water erodes stone, drop by drop, until it creates a deep void where self-esteem once was. Thomas and Monica moved into our large city apartment for logistical reasons, as they explained while packing Arthur's belongings into cardboard boxes labeled with a black marker. "It's more convenient for our jobs," Monica added as she wrapped the gold watch Arthur had inherited from his father in bubble wrap. "Besides, this place has more space for the kids." I was relegated to the guest room, a small room that faced the inner courtyard where the laundry was hung. The walls were painted a faded beige that reminded me of hospitals, and the only window was so small that barely any natural light came in during the day. My king-sized bed, where I had slept for 4 decades, was replaced with a twin bed with a mattress so thin I could feel the springs digging into my back every night. "It's temporary, Mom," Thomas assured me as he dismantled my mahogany vanity. "Just until we decide what to do with the layout." But I knew it wasn't temporary. It was my new place in the family hierarchy, a small, dark corner where I could exist without being too much of a bother. Alyssa transformed Arthur's study into a Pilates and meditation room. She hired a renovation crew that worked for 3 weeks installing floor-to-ceiling mirrors, floating bamboo floors, and dimmable LED lights that created relaxing ambiances. The solid oak desk where Arthur had managed the family finances for years was sold on Facebook Marketplace for $300. "I need my own space for my personal wellness," she explained as she supervised the installation of a ballet bar. "Dad doesn't need it anymore, and you never come in here anyway." She was right. Arthur had forbidden me from entering his study for years, but watching them transform his last refuge into a personal gym hurt in a way I couldn't explain. It was as if they were systematically erasing any trace of the life we had shared, any evidence that I had been part of this family for 4 decades. In that new guest room, they started entering without knocking. Monica would burst in at any hour to look for extra blankets or clean linens. Alyssa would suddenly appear to use my closet as temporary storage. Thomas would go through my drawers looking for important documents that Arthur had supposedly stored there. "Mom, sort out your things," Alyssa told me one morning while emptying one of my drawers to make room for her yoga gear. "We're going to use this closet for sports equipment. You can't hoard so much space when you barely have any possessions." Barely have any possessions. As if a lifetime of memories, photographs, books, and personal items could be reduced to an inventory assessment based on commercial value. But the deepest humiliation came one Thursday afternoon when I returned from buying bread at the corner bakery, the small family-owned shop where they had known me for 20 years, and where Mrs. Carroll always asked about my children with genuine affection. When I got home, I heard voices in the kitchen. I immediately recognized Monica's sharp tone and Thomas's grave response. I approached silently, not intending to eavesdrop, just to announce I was back. But what I heard froze me behind the half-open door. "Why don't we just move her to one of those places for seniors down in Florida?" Monica was saying as she opened and closed kitchen cabinets. "My cousin visited one last month and said they have really fun activities. Painting classes, bingo, organized trips. She doesn't contribute anything here anymore, Thomas. She just takes up space and creates extra work for us." "It's not that simple," my son replied with a weary tone, as if discussing the logistics of getting rid of old furniture. "We'd have to sell the house to pay for the facility, and the real estate market is tough right now. Besides, financially, it's better for us to keep her here. She doesn't pay rent, and she takes care of all the housework." "But psychologically, it's exhausting," Monica insisted. "She's always there, watching, silently judging, and the kids are starting to see her as the sad grandma who lives in the small room. It's not the family image we want to project. The family image we want to project." As if my presence in the house that had been my home for decades was a public relations problem that needed to be solved. I felt as if my skin were being peeled from my bones. a literal physical sensation of tearing that started in my chest and spread through my entire body to my fingertips. I had to lean against the hallway wall to keep from falling. I had given them life. I had sewn their school uniforms with my own hands late at night when we didn't have money for new clothes. I had sold my jewelry to pay for their whims. I had cared for their children when they needed the freedom to build their careers. And now I was a psychological burden, an obstacle to the perfect image they wanted to maintain for their Back Bay friends. I went up to my room in silence, closing the door with the care of someone who doesn't want to be caught existing. I sat on the edge of the twin bed and looked out the small window at the inner courtyard. I could see the neighbor's laundry hanging, white sheets billowing gently, brightly colored children's t-shirts, underwear hung with the efficiency of those who had normal domestic routines and families who valued them. That night, I didn't go down for dinner. I stayed in my room pretending to be sick while I listened to the laughter coming from the dining room. They had ordered Chinese food from that expensive place on Boylston Street, where the portions cost $20, but came in elegant containers that made people feel like they were dining at a luxury restaurant. No one came up to ask if I was hungry. No one knocked on my door to offer me a plate of General Tso's chicken or spring rolls. They simply assumed my absence was irrelevant, that the family dinner worked perfectly well without the presence of the woman who had cooked thousands of dinners for them over 4 decades. The next day, I decided to try something. A cruel experiment on myself, but necessary to confirm my most painful suspicions. It was my 67th birthday. I didn't say anything. I left no hints. I made no indirect comments. I simply waited to see if anyone remembered the date they had celebrated with me for 66 consecutive years. I got up at my usual time, prepared the family breakfast with the usual precision, ironed the clothes they would need for their respective jobs, and cleaned the kitchen until the tiles gleamed like mirrors. I performed every domestic task with the mechanical perfection I had developed over decades of practice. Thomas ate his breakfast quickly while checking emails on his phone. "I'll be home late tonight, Mom. I have a meeting with some Japanese investors." He didn't even look up when he said goodbye. Alyssa appeared in the kitchen dressed in a pearl gray pantsuit and heels that clicked against the tiles like castanets. "Have you seen my car keys?" she asked while rummaging through drawers. She found them, dropped them in her Italian leather handbag, and left the house without another word. Monica took the kids to school and then went straight to work. The little ones gave me mechanical kisses on the cheek, automated gestures they had learned out of politeness rather than genuine affection. By 9 in the morning, the house was completely silent. Just me, sitting in the kitchen, drinking black coffee because there was no milk left. Looking at the wall calendar where October 15th was clearly marked with a red circle I had drawn myself the week before. The hours passed. No one called. No one texted. No one showed up with cheap flowers from the market or a last-minute cake from the neighborhood bakery. At 7 in the evening, when they all returned from their jobs, we had dinner in silence. Roast chicken with potatoes that I had prepared with special care, using the herbs I grew in pots on the balcony. The food was delicious, but no one commented. At 10 that night, as I was getting ready for bed in my twin bed, I heard Monica say to Thomas, "Tomorrow is my mother's birthday. We have to buy her something nice. We can't forget like we did last year." They remembered Monica's mother's birthday perfectly. They had planned ahead, chosen gifts, made dinner reservations. But my birthday had passed unnoticed as if it were just any other day on the calendar. That night, for the first time in 67 years, I didn't cry on my birthday. Instead, I felt something worse than sadness. I felt a cold clarity that cut through me like a shard of ice. I understood, with painful precision, that I was no longer a beloved mother in this house. I was simply an unpaid housekeeper who happened to share their last name. I looked at myself in the small mirror on my new closet door. I saw an old woman with deep wrinkles around her eyes, silver hair badly cut because I could no longer afford the expensive salon in the neighborhood, and an expression of defeat that I didn't recognize as my own. For the first time in my adult life, I wondered what would have happened if I had made different choices, if I had said no sometimes, if I had set boundaries, if I had demanded respect instead of giving it away for free for 4 decades. But it was too late for those questions. Or so I thought. The morning that changed everything began like any other. with the alarm clock ringing at 6 sharp and my bare feet touching the cold floor of the guest room. It had rained during the night, and the inner courtyard smelled of damp earth and wet leaves, a scent that drifted through my small window. I prepared breakfast with the usual automated routine: fresh coffee, toast, and orange juice that I squeezed while listening to the house wake up. Thomas showering with the water on full blast, making the pipes vibrate. Monica blow-drying her hair with a professional dryer that sounded like a jet engine. The kids arguing over who had taken the other's tablet. But that day, as I wiped down the granite countertop where they had eaten without a word of thanks, my hand bumped into something that would change my perspective forever. Thomas's cell phone, forgotten next to the Italian coffee maker I had bought 20 years ago at a market in the North End. Normally, I would have picked up the device and taken it to his room without a second thought. It was the kind of automatic motherly gesture I had repeated thousands of times, picking up forgotten items, tidying others' belongings, anticipating needs without being asked. But when I picked it up, the screen lit up automatically, showing a WhatsApp conversation that was open, a conversation that included my name. I should have closed the app immediately. I should have respected his privacy. But there was something in the tone of the messages, in the casual way my name appeared in their conversation, that made me pause. The conversation was with Alyssa, and it had been active for days. "The old lady is getting so needy," my son had written 2 nights earlier at 11:47 p.m. while I was sleeping in my twin bed, believing that at least my children respected me in private. I know. Yesterday she asked me 3 times if I needed help with anything. "It's smothering," Alyssa replied. "Plus, she's always complaining that we don't visit, as if we have an obligation to entertain her. The problem is she's become too emotionally dependent. Dad kept her in check, but now she thinks she has the right to an opinion on everything." My hands started to shake. Holding the phone became difficult, as if the device weighed 20 pounds instead of a few ounces. "Have you seen the look she gives us when we make plans without her? That victim face she puts on is unbearable. LOL, yeah, exactly. And always with those passive-aggressive comments. How nice that you have time to go out. I'll just stay here quietly." It's pure emotional manipulation. I kept reading with a morbid fascination, like someone who can't look away from a car crash despite the horror. What bothers me most is that she acts like we owe her something, as if all her motherly sacrifices were investments she now has the right to cash in. Exactly. We didn't ask her to sell her things to pay for our classes. Those were her decisions. She can't use that as emotional blackmail now. I felt as if someone had scooped out my stomach with an ice-cold spoon. Every word was a direct stab at memories I had treasured as the purest moments of my motherhood. My ring sold for Thomas's tennis, the weekends cleaning houses for Alyssa's camera, the sleepless nights when they had fevers. All of it had been reduced to emotional blackmail and manipulation, but the worst was yet to come. Anyway, the issue is going to resolve itself, Thomas wrote, with a coldness that chilled my blood. "David and I have been reviewing Dad's will with the lawyer. There are some inconsistencies we're going to challenge legally." "What kind of inconsistencies?" "The beach house, mainly. Dad was very sick in his last months. It's possible he didn't have full mental competency when he made certain changes to the will. If we can prove that, we can nullify the clauses that benefit her." My vision blurred. I had to sit down on one of the kitchen chairs because my legs stopped working. "Seriously? Is that legal?" "David says it is. We have witnesses who can testify that Dad was confused towards the end. The medication, the stress. It's easy to argue he wasn't in a condition to make important decisions. Besides, since when would Dad do something like that for her? It's obviously inconsistent with his character." "Great. Because honestly, the thought of her getting the beach house makes my stomach turn. That property is worth at least $1 million. A woman who never worked a day in her life outside the home can't just end up with that much money. A woman who never worked a day in her life outside the home, as if creating 2 human beings, raising them for decades, maintaining a household, caring for a distant husband, and sacrificing every personal ambition wasn't work. As if the 40 years of my life dedicated entirely to their well-being had no measurable economic value. The only thing I'm worried about is her getting dramatic when she finds out. Alyssa continued. You know how she is. She's liable to start with the victim act and try to make us feel guilty. Doesn't matter. At this point, I'm immune to her manipulations. Besides, it's not personal. It's just fair. Dad built that estate with his work. We are his true heirs. True heirs. As if I had been an imposter in my own family for 4 decades. The phone slipped from my hands and hit the kitchen tiles with a sharp crack that echoed through the house. The screen spiderwebbed, but it kept working, displaying the conversation that had shattered the last vestiges of illusion I held about my children. I sat there staring at the broken device on the floor, identifying with that fractured screen. I too had been shattered, but I was still functioning, still showing a distorted but recognizable image of what I had once been. The next few hours passed in a fog of mechanical movements. I picked up the phone, left it where I had found it, finished cleaning the kitchen, made the beds, organized the laundry, but I performed each task like an automaton, with no real awareness of what I was doing. When Thomas came home that afternoon, he found his phone where he had left it. He noticed the cracked screen immediately. What happened to my phone? He asked with irritation, examining the cracks. It fell off the counter this morning when I was cleaning. I lied with a calmness that surprised me. I'm so sorry. He sighed with exasperation. Mom, you have to be more careful. These phones cost $1,000. $1,000. Curious that he remembered the exact price of his phone, but had forgotten the value of 4 decades of motherly sacrifices. That night, alone in my small room, I sat in front of the closet mirror and truly looked at myself for the first time in months. I saw a 67-year-old woman who had dedicated her entire life to people who considered her a manipulative burden, a woman who had confused unconditional love with emotional self-mutilation. But I also saw something else. In my tired eyes, behind the dark circles and worry lines, there was a flicker of something I hadn't felt in decades. Rage. Pure, crystalline, justified rage. Not the blind rage that destroys everything in its path. It was a cold, calculated rage that clarified my thoughts instead of clouding them. For the first time in my adult life, I understood the difference between being a good mother and being a fool who lets herself be trampled by people who share her DNA. I stood up from the small stool in front of the mirror and walked to the window overlooking the inner courtyard. I could see the lights on in the apartments across the way. Families eating dinner together, children doing homework while their parents patiently supervised, older couples watching television on shared sofas, normal lives, families where mutual respect wasn't a bargaining chip, but a fundamental foundation. For the first time in 4 decades, I wondered what it would feel like to live like that, what it would feel like to be valued for who I was, not for what I could provide, what it would feel like to say no when something bothered me, instead of smiling and enduring it until resentment poisoned my soul. I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed awake until dawn, planning, not revenge, because that would have been stooping to their level. I was planning for dignity, planning for self-respect, planning the boundaries I should have set decades ago. The next day, when I got up to prepare the family breakfast, something fundamental had changed inside me. What I had read on that broken phone still hurt. I still felt betrayed and humiliated, but I no longer felt helpless. For the first time in my life, I had a plan, and for the first time in 4 decades, that plan did not involve sacrificing myself for people who considered my sacrifices to be emotional manipulation. It was time they learned the difference between a mother who gives love and a mother who demands respect. The days following my discovery were like walking barefoot on broken glass. Every interaction with my children became a performance where I pretended not to know what they really thought of me, while they continued their routines of condescension disguised as filial affection. But something had fundamentally changed in how I observed them. It was as if I had developed a new kind of vision that allowed me to see through the masks they had perfected over the years. Every gesture, every seemingly innocent comment, every poorly concealed look of impatience, I now saw them with the painful clarity of someone who finally understands she has been the butt of a cruel, decades-long joke. The first significant change came on a Tuesday morning. Monica entered the kitchen as I was preparing breakfast, shuffling in her pink velvet slippers she'd bought at Nordstrom for $90. She went straight to the pantry for the imported brand-name cereal that cost $7 a box. "Evelyn," she said, using that tone she employed when she wanted to sound authoritative but polite, "we're going to need you to pick up the kids from school this week. I have important meetings with new clients, and Thomas is tied up with the Japanese investors." Normally, I would have replied, "Of course, dear," without a second thought. I would have rearranged any personal plans, canceled a doctor's appointment or my weekly trip to the market, and adjusted my entire life to accommodate their needs, as I had done for 4 decades. But this time, something different came out of my mouth. No. The word sounded foreign even to me. Short, clear, final. No excuses, no justifications, no cascade of apologetic explanations that usually accompanied any refusal I dared to utter. Monica froze, cereal box in hand, staring at me as if I had just started speaking in Mandarin. "Excuse me?" "I said no," I repeated, surprised by how natural it felt to hold my ground. "I can't pick up the children this week." "You can't or you won't." Her voice had risen half an octave, adopting that passive-aggressive edge that women of her social class had perfected into a social martial art. "It doesn't make a difference," I replied, spreading butter on a piece of toast with deliberately slow movements. "The result is the same." Monica stared at me for several seconds, clearly calculating whether this was a temporary anomaly or the start of something more troublesome. Finally, she slammed the cereal box down on the counter with more force than necessary. "Fine. I guess we'll have to hire someone then." Her tone implied that I was personally responsible for any financial inconvenience this would cause. "I guess you will," I confirmed, offering no apologies or alternatives. When she left the kitchen, I heard her hurried footsteps on the stairs, followed by the sound of a door slamming shut. 20 minutes later, as I watered the plants on the balcony, I heard her on the phone with someone, probably her mother or sister, using that high-pitched voice she adopted when she needed validation for her outrage. Completely unreasonable. After everything we've done for her, I don't understand what's gotten into her lately. I smiled for the first time in weeks. It was a small, almost imperceptible smile, but it was real. Thomas's reaction came that afternoon. He'd had time to process the morning's incident and prepare a more sophisticated strategy than his wife's direct confrontation. He found me in the living room, mending a blouse. I had learned to sew in my youth when money was tight and buying new clothes was a luxury. It was a skill I had kept out of habit. "Mom," he began, sitting on the sofa next to me with that calculated physical proximity he used when he wanted to be persuasive. "Monica told me what happened this morning. I'm a little worried about you." Worried. As if my first refusal in 4 decades was a symptom of some mental decline requiring medical intervention. "Worried about what?" I asked without looking up from my sewing. "Well, it's not like you to refuse to help with the kids. You've always been so cooperative, so willing to lend a hand when we need it." His voice took on the condescending tone he probably used with difficult clients at his consultancy. "Are you feeling okay? Is something bothering you?" The question was a perfect trap. If I said I was fine, my refusal was inexplicable and likely selfish. If I admitted something was bothering me, I became the problematic mother creating unnecessary drama in a harmonious family. "I'm feeling perfectly fine," I replied, finally looking up to meet his eyes. "I've simply decided I have the right to say no when something doesn't work for me." "Doesn't work for you?" His expression shifted subtly, as if I had said something obscene at a family dinner. "Mom, they're your grandchildren. Taking care of them shouldn't be something that works for you or not. It should be something you want to do." There it was, the perfectly articulated maternal guilt trip, the implication that a grandmother who wasn't available 24/7 for the needs of others was fundamentally flawed in her family instincts. "Of course I want to spend time with my grandchildren," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "But I want to do it on terms that work for everyone, not just when you need a free emergency babysitter." The word "free" landed between us like a stone in a quiet pond. Thomas blinked several times, clearly uncomfortable with the explicit financial reference. "That's not how we see it," he said after a pause. "We've never thought of you as an employee. You're our mother. It's different." "Different in what way?" I pressed. In that an employee would get paid for her time and have set hours and guaranteed days off? Thomas stood up from the sofa abruptly, with that nervous energy he'd shown since childhood when a conversation didn't go his way. I don't understand why you're being so combative, he said, searching for the right word. This isn't like you, Mom. You're usually so much more reasonable. Reasonable. Another perfect word. In their family vocabulary, reasonable meant willing to sacrifice her own needs without complaint. A reasonable woman didn't set boundaries or demand reciprocity. Perhaps, I said, carefully folding the blouse I had finished mending, the problem isn't that I'm less reasonable now, but that I've been far too reasonable for far too long. That night, after a tense, quiet dinner, I heard Thomas and Monica talking in their room. Their voices carried through the thin walls, though they were clearly trying to keep it down. She has to stop this before it becomes a bigger problem. Maybe we should talk to Alyssa. A unified family strategy. I can't believe a woman her age would suddenly become so selfish. Selfish. The ultimate accusation against any woman who dared to prioritize her own needs. For 4 decades, I had been the antithesis of selfish. A self-sacrificing mother, a compliant wife, an available grandmother. But the moment I set a single, minimal boundary, I was instantly selfish. The coordinated intervention arrived the next day. Alyssa showed up in the afternoon, unannounced, carrying flowers and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She brought her youngest daughter, Christina, who was 8, clearly as emotional ammunition for the planned conversation. "Grandma!" Christina yelled, running toward me with open arms. I hugged her with genuine pleasure. Despite everything, my grandchildren were not responsible for their parents' issues, and my love for them remained untouched. "I thought we could have tea together," Alyssa announced, heading straight for the kitchen to get cups. Like old times. Old times. When I would prepare elaborate snacks for unannounced visitors. When my time and energy were unconditionally available to anyone who chose to claim them. I made tea and brought out the butter cookies I had baked over the weekend. Christina sat between us, oblivious to the tense undercurrents flowing beneath the seemingly normal conversation about her school and friends. After 20 minutes of small talk, Alyssa sent Christina to the living room with a tablet, clearly setting the stage for the real conversation. "Mom," she began, adopting that perfected tone of filial concern. "Thomas told me what happened yesterday with Monica. We're a little worried about you." It was the second time in 2 days that someone had expressed concern for my mental well-being based solely on the fact that I had said no to a request. "There's nothing to worry about," I replied calmly. "But it's not like you to be so—" She searched for the word carefully. "So inflexible. You've always been so generous with your time, so willing to help. And I will continue to help when I can and when I feel like it," I clarified. "The difference is that now the decision is mine." Alyssa looked at me as if I'd just announced I was joining an extremist cult. "But why now?" she asked. "What's changed?" It was a dangerous question. I could tell her about the conversation I'd read on her brother's phone, about how they had reduced 4 decades of my sacrifices to emotional manipulation. I could explain that I'd discovered my own children were planning to legally challenge the inheritance their father had left me. But I sensed that a direct confrontation would only lead to denials, excuses, and accusations that I had violated Thomas's privacy. Instead of earning respect, it would only create more resentment. "What's changed," I said finally, "is that I've started to value my own time as much as I value yours." The conversation continued for another hour, with Alyssa alternating between emotional pleas and subtle attempts to make me feel guilty for developing personal boundaries. But something fundamental had changed in my ability to resist those manipulations. It was as if I had developed an immunity to a virus I had been vulnerable to for decades. When they left, I sat alone in the kitchen, drinking the dregs of cold tea, and realized something surprising. For the first time in a long time, I felt proud of myself. A week after my first refusal, I made the most radical decision of my adult life. It was Friday morning, and the October sun streamed through the kitchen window, creating golden patterns on the tiles I had scrubbed thousands of times. Thomas was eating breakfast while checking emails on his phone, the same device with the cracked screen that held the conversation that had changed everything. Monica was hastily feeding the children before taking them to school. Alyssa hadn't shown up yet, but I knew she would, expecting me to make her special half-calf latte and iron the outfit she needed for her weekend Pilates class. It was the perfect routine, the domestic choreography I had rehearsed for decades, until it became an automatic dance of unconditional service. But that Friday, instead of starting my mental to-do list, I went straight to my small room and pulled out the brown leather suitcase I had used for my honeymoon 40 years ago. It was covered in dust and smelled of mothballs, but the zippers still worked, and the inner lining, though faded, was intact. I started to pack, not with the desperate haste of someone fleeing, but with the calm deliberation of someone who has finally made a decision she has been postponing for years. I carefully folded 3 dresses, a week's worth of undergarments, the comfortable shoes I wore for walks, my toothbrush, and the jar of face cream from the corner pharmacy. I also packed 3 sentimental items: a photo of my parents on their wedding day, taken in 1952, the pearl rosary my grandmother gave me for my 15th birthday, and a book of Robert Frost poems I had bought with my first teenage savings, which I had reread during difficult times throughout my life. The sound of the zipper closing echoed in the small room like a declaration of independence. I came down the stairs with the suitcase in my hand. The rattle of its small wheels against the marble steps immediately drew the attention of everyone in the kitchen. "Where are you going, Mom?" Thomas asked, finally looking up from his phone. "To the beach house," I replied with a calm that surprised even me. The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the hum of traffic on the street, the sound of neighbors getting ready for the day, the ticking of the grandfather clock Arthur had bought at an auction years ago. "What?" Monica dropped the spoon she was using to feed her youngest son his yogurt. "What are you talking about?" "I'm going to spend some time in Chatham, at the beach house, by myself." "Mom?" Thomas intervened with the voice he used when he wanted to sound reasonable but authoritative. "You can't just go to that house alone. It's too isolated, especially now that it's getting cold. Besides, we don't even know if everything is working after the winter." "Then it will be an adventure to find out," I replied, heading for the front door. Alyssa chose that exact moment to arrive, as if summoned by some family instinct that detected a developing crisis. She came through the main door just as I was leaving with my suitcase, and we met face to face in the foyer. "What is going on here?" she asked, looking from my suitcase to my determined expression, and then to the worried faces of Thomas and Monica, who had appeared behind me. "Your mother has decided to go on a vacation without consulting anyone," Monica explained, using the tone she reserved for behavior she considered irresponsible. "It's not a vacation," I clarified. "It's a temporary change of residence, possibly permanent." The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and tangible. Alyssa looked at me as if I had just announced my intention to join the circus. "Mom, this is ridiculous," she said, physically blocking my path to the door. "You can't just leave like this, out of the blue, without a plan, without giving us notice. What will the neighbors say? What are we going to tell people when they ask about you? What will the neighbors say?" The fundamental concern that had governed so many family decisions for years. How we would appear to others, what image we would project, what people whose opinions had no real impact on our lives would think. "You'll tell them the truth," I answered. "That I've decided to live in my own house." "But that's not your house," Thomas exploded. "It's Dad's house. He built it. He paid for it. He died," I interrupted him, my softness a stark contrast to his rising volume. "And according to his will, which I reviewed with the lawyer yesterday, that house is now mine, completely mine." The lie slipped from my lips with a fluency that astonished me. I hadn't spoken to any lawyer. I hadn't reviewed any will, but something in my expression, in the confidence of my voice, made them hesitate. I saw them exchange quick glances, calculating probabilities, wondering what information I could possibly have that they didn't. "Besides," I continued, taking advantage of their momentary confusion, "I think we'll all be more comfortable with a little space between us." I left the house before they could organize themselves to physically stop me. I walked along the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill with my suitcase rolling behind me, heading toward South Station where I would take a bus to Hyannis, and then a local shuttle to Chatham. It was the first time in 4 decades that I had made a major decision without consulting anyone, without asking permission, without justifying my motives to a family committee that had turned my life into a democracy where I had a voice but no vote. The bus ride was a moving meditation. I watched through the window as the urban landscape of Boston gradually transformed into sprawling suburbs, then into marshlands, and finally into the rugged coastline of Cape Cod. Every mile that distanced me from the city felt like years of weight lifting from my shoulders. The beach house was exactly as I remembered it from my last visit, 6 months before Arthur's death. It was a 2-story structure with white clapboard siding and classic blue shutters, situated in a small cove where the sound of the waves created a constant, natural soundtrack. Arthur had bought it 25 years ago as an investment, but over the years it had become his personal weekend refuge, a place where he could read financial papers without interruption and review contracts while I prepared meals we ate on the deck overlooking the ocean. Now, for the first time, it was all mine. The key was where we always kept it, under a geranium pot by the back door. I stepped into a house that smelled of sea salt, and that particular scent of homes closed up for a long time, a mixture of dampness, old wood, and memories suspended in the air. I opened all the windows and doors, letting the sea breeze circulate through the rooms and carry away the stagnant air. The October sun poured in, illuminating dust particles that danced like tiny domestic spirits celebrating my arrival. The first night, I slept with the windows open, listening to the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the rocks at the foot of the bluff. It was a sound I had heard for entire summers, but always as a backdrop to other activities. Family conversations, meal preparations, supervising children playing on the beach. Now it was just for me. The sea was singing me a personal, intimate lullaby, rocking me into the deepest sleep I'd had in months. I woke at dawn, not out of obligation, but for the simple pleasure of watching the sun emerge from the sea's horizon. I made coffee in the small Italian press, sat on the deck with a blanket over my shoulders, and watched as the golden light transformed the water's surface into a mosaic of sparkles. For the first time in decades, I had no to-do list waiting for me. There were no breakfasts to prepare for others, no beds to make, no clothes to iron, no phone calls to answer. My time belonged completely to me. It was a strange, almost dizzying sensation, as if I had been living in a small room for years and someone had suddenly knocked down the walls, revealing an infinite space I never knew existed. I spent the day exploring the house as if it were unknown territory. I found books Arthur had left behind, novels by classic American authors I'd never had time to read. I discovered a collection of vinyl records hidden in a cabinet, music from the 60s and 70s that immediately transported me to my youth, when I still had my own dreams that didn't revolve around the needs of others. I put on a James Taylor record and danced alone in the living room, arms outstretched, bare feet on the cold tile floor. It was ridiculous and liberating all at once. It had been years since I had moved for the sheer pleasure of movement, without the pressure of performing tasks efficiently or maintaining the proper dignity for a woman my age. That afternoon, my cell phone began to ring incessantly. Thomas, Alyssa, Monica, even numbers I didn't recognize, but were likely relatives mobilized for the cause of convincing me to return to my former role. After the 5th call, I turned off the device and put it in a kitchen drawer. The silence that followed was glorious. For the first time in 4 decades, no one knew exactly where I was, what I was doing, or when I would be available to solve their problems. I was invisible in the best possible way, free to be observed, judged, or required for immediate service. That night, I had fresh fish I'd bought from the small-town market, paired with a bottle of local white wine that I drank slowly while watching the stars from the deck. It wasn't an elaborate or elegant dinner, but every bite tasted like freedom. I went to bed early, exhausted not from physical work, but from the emotional intensity of taking the bravest step of my life. Before I fell asleep, I thought of my children, probably gathered in the Boston kitchen, discussing strategies to bring me back into the family fold. But for the first time in decades, their worries and plans were not my responsibility to solve. 3 weeks after my arrival in Chatham, Just as I had begun to settle into the leisurely rhythm of days free from family obligations, the inevitable final confrontation arrived on a Saturday morning in the form of 3 cars parked in front of the house. I had seen them coming from the bedroom window as I dressed with the tranquility of someone who was no longer in a hurry for anything. Thomas drove his black BMW, followed by Alyssa's silver Audi, and bringing up the rear, Monica's family SUV, loaded with what looked like provisions for a prolonged siege. They had come prepared for war. During those 3 weeks of solitude in the beach house, I had experienced a transformation I hadn't thought possible at 67. I had rediscovered simple pleasures I'd forgotten existed. Waking up when my body decided, not when the alarm clock ordered. Eating what I felt like, when I felt like it, without considering the preferences of others. Reading for hours without interruption. Walking along the beach collecting shells that no one else would value, but that to me seemed like small treasures. I had also done things I had never allowed myself during my life as a dedicated wife and mother. I had danced in my underwear throughout the house with Bob Dylan playing at full volume. I had eaten ice cream straight from the carton for breakfast. I had spent entire afternoons painting with watercolors I'd bought at the town's art supply store, creating terrible but colorful pictures that I proudly hung on the walls as if they were masterpieces. For the first time in 4 decades, I had rediscovered myself as an individual, not as an extension of others' needs. But I knew this confrontation was inevitable. My children were not the type of people to accept losing control over something they considered theirs, and apparently, that included me. I walked down the stairs slowly, unhurriedly, and opened the front door before they had a chance to knock. I found them standing in a semicircle on the small front lawn, like an official delegation prepared for complex diplomatic negotiations. Thomas was wearing his Sunday suit, the gray wool one he used for important occasions. Alyssa was dressed entirely in black, as if attending a funeral, with designer sunglasses that hid her eyes but not her determined expression. Monica had opted for a casual but clearly expensive ensemble, her brand name handbag hanging from her arm like a weapon of social status. "Hello, Mom," Thomas said with that controlled voice he used in difficult professional meetings. "We need to talk." "Of course," I replied, standing in the doorway without inviting them in. "Talk." The gesture did not go unnoticed. Normally, I would have ushered them in immediately, prepared coffee, found comfortable chairs, and created the cozy atmosphere that would facilitate whatever conversation they wanted to have. But those days were over. "Aren't you going to invite us in?" Alyssa asked, clearly bewildered by the violation of the basic rules of maternal hospitality she had taken for granted for decades. "That depends on why you've come," I answered. "If it's a social visit, you're welcome. If it's a family intervention to convince me to return to my previous role, I'd rather we talk out here." Monica exchanged a quick glance with Thomas. They had evidently prepared a strategy that depended on the comfort of a controlled indoor environment. "Mom," Alyssa began, taking off her sunglasses to make direct eye contact. "We're worried about you. You've been here alone for weeks, with no regular contact, living like a hermit. This can't continue." "Why not?" I asked with genuine curiosity. The question temporarily threw them off balance. It was clear they had anticipated tears, apologies, promises to come home, but not a calm interrogation of their basic premises. "Because it's not normal," Monica said finally. "Women your age don't just leave home suddenly to live alone in isolated houses. It's irresponsible." "Irresponsible to whom?" I pressed. "To us," Thomas exploded, finally losing the professional composure he had maintained until that moment. "We're your family. We have a right to know you're okay, to have you be a part of our lives, to have you act like the mother you've always been." There it was, the involuntary confession of what truly bothered them. They weren't worried about my well-being. They were furious about the loss of control, about the absence of the free domestic and emotional service they had grown accustomed to. "The mother I've always been," I repeated slowly, "was a woman who constantly sacrificed for people who considered those sacrifices emotional manipulation." The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the sound of seagulls in the distance and the constant murmur of the sea against the rocks. "What are you talking about?" Alyssa asked, but her voice had lost its certainty. Instead of answering directly, I went back inside the house and returned with Thomas's cell phone, which I had quietly had repaired during my second week in Chatham. I held it out to him without a word. He took it automatically, then frowned, realizing the screen was no longer cracked. "Check your text messages from October 18th, I said calmly. The conversation with Alyssa about the needy old lady and the plans to nullify your father's will. I watched the color drain completely from his face. Alyssa went rigid like a marble statue. Monica looked back and forth between them, trying to understand what information had been discovered. "Mom," Thomas began in a weak voice. "No," I interrupted him firmly. "I don't want explanations. I don't want apologies. I don't want promises that you didn't really mean it. For 3 weeks, I've had time to fully process what you really think of me, and to decide what I'm going to do about it." I went inside again and returned with a folder of documents I had meticulously prepared during those days of solitude. "These are the papers from your father's will," I announced, pulling out certified copies I had requested from the lawyer in Boston. "As you can see, the beach house belongs to me completely, without conditions or restrictions. I am also the owner of an investment account worth $1.7 million that your father kept secret for years." The figures fell between us like bombs. I saw Thomas and Alyssa quickly calculate the financial implications, saw their plans to question Arthur's mental competency crumble in the face of irrefutable legal evidence. "But that's impossible," Alyssa murmured. "Dad would have told us." "Your father," I said with a clarity that surprised me, "apparently understood better than you the difference between a mother who deserves respect and children who consider that respect optional." I pulled another document from the folder. "This is a power of attorney I signed this week, appointing the law firm Miller & Associates in Boston as administrators of all my assets. They will handle any future legal communication you wish to have with me." Monica finally found her voice. "Evelyn, this is insane. You can't cut off your own family over a misunderstanding." "It's not a misunderstanding," I interrupted. "It's a clarification. For 4 decades, I confused unconditional love with unlimited availability. I confused being a good mother with being an unpaid housekeeper. I confused maternal sacrifice with emotional self-mutilation." I stepped toward Thomas and touched his cheek gently, with the same gesture I had used to comfort him when he was a child, having nightmares. "I love you," I told him, a tenderness welling up from my heart. "I love all of you, but I will no longer buy your love with my dignity." I stepped back into the doorway. "If you ever decide you want a relationship with me based on mutual respect, instead of one-way service, you know where to find me. Until then, I hope you find someone else willing to be treated as an unpaid emotional housekeeper." I went into the house and closed the door gently, without slamming it, without drama. Simply establishing a physical boundary that symbolized all the emotional boundaries I should have set decades ago. Through the window, I watched them for several more minutes, talking among themselves with agitated gestures, clearly discussing alternative strategies. Thomas tried to knock on the door twice, but I didn't answer. Alyssa shouted my name from the yard, but I remained silent. Finally, I heard engines starting and the sound of the 3 cars driving away down the gravel path that led back to the main road. When the silence returned, I sat on the living room sofa and cried for the first time since my arrival in Chatham. But they weren't tears of sadness or regret. They were tears of profound relief, of liberation, of having finally found the courage to choose my own dignity over the conditional love I had been chasing for decades. That night, for the first time in my adult life, I went to bed knowing I had defended my self-worth without apologizing for it. 6 months after the confrontation that changed my life forever, I wake up each morning with something I had forgotten existed, the feeling that the day belongs completely to me. It's an April morning in Chatham, and the New England sun streams through the open windows of my bedroom, carrying the scent of the wild roses that have started to bloom on the nearby dunes. I get up without rushing, put on the blue silk robe I bought last week at a boutique in town, and go down to make coffee in a kitchen now decorated with my own paintings and plants that grow toward the light like living metaphors for my rebirth. The transformation hasn't just been emotional, it's also been deeply practical. During these months of chosen solitude, I've learned to do things I never allowed myself during my 4 decades of family devotion. I've taken watercolor classes at the town's art center, where a group of women of all ages meets on Tuesdays and Thursdays to create art that no one judges and that only we value. I've learned to use basic tools for minor home repairs, discovering a natural knack for practical problem solving when I don't have to consult anyone else's opinion before acting. I've also started something I never thought I would: a small business of my own. With part of the money from Arthur's inheritance, I've converted the ground floor of the house into an artisanal sewing workshop where I teach other women to make and mend clothing. It's something I always knew how to do, but had relegated to invisible domestic chores. Now, 3 afternoons a week, my home is filled with women's voices, laughter, conversations about embroidery techniques and sewing patterns, but also about deferred dreams, complicated relationships, and the courage it takes to reinvent yourself after 60. My students are a fascinating mix. Eleanor, a 72-year-old widow who wants to learn to sew dresses for her granddaughters. Carol, a 55-year-old who lost her job in Boston and decided to move to the coast to start a new life. Susan, a recent divorcee who is rediscovering who she is when not defined in relation to a husband who undervalued her. We all have something in common. We've reached a point in our lives where we've decided it's more important to be authentic than to be convenient for others. The money I earn from the classes isn't much, but it's mine. Every dollar represents my ability to create value independently, to offer something others appreciate without having to sacrifice my dignity in the process. It's an intoxicating feeling I had never experienced during my years of total financial dependence. I've also started traveling, something Arthur always considered unnecessary and expensive. Last month, I went to Savannah to visit the city's historic art scene. I traveled alone, stayed in a small hotel in the historic district, walked the cobblestone streets, visited Forsyth Park and the Telfair museums, and ate in restaurants where no one knew me and where I could simply be an older woman enjoying her own company. It was during that trip that I realized I had spent 67 years without ever truly knowing myself as an independent individual. I had always been someone's daughter, then someone's wife, then someone's mother. Never just Evelyn, with her own tastes, opinions, preferences, and dreams. In Savannah, I discovered that I love jazz music, that I enjoy walking alone through unfamiliar cities, that I can hold fascinating conversations with strangers in cafes, that I have my own political opinions that don't necessarily align with my family's. It was like meeting a new person who had been living inside me for decades, patiently waiting for her turn to exist. But not all of it has been easy. There have been nights of profound loneliness, moments of doubt about whether I made the right choices, days when the silence from my children hurt like a physical wound that wouldn't heal. Thomas has called me exactly 3 times in these 6 months. Brief, formal conversations where he asks about my health with the distant courtesy he'd use with a faraway acquaintance. He never mentions visiting, never suggests he misses our old conversations, never acknowledges that something fundamental changed between us the day I discovered what he really thought of me. Alyssa has opted for complete silence. According to a former Boston neighbor I ran into at a market in Hyannis, she has moved to Chicago with her family and rarely mentions my name when people ask. Apparently, she has decided it's easier to act as if I've ceased to exist than to confront her own culpability for having treated me like an emotional housekeeper for decades. Monica, curiously, has been the only one to try and maintain some kind of contact. She sends occasional text messages with photos of the children, superficial family news, polite invitations to events she knows I won't accept. I think she understands, better than my own children, that what happened between us wasn't a temporary misunderstanding, but a fundamental reassessment of the terms on which I'm willing to maintain family relationships. The grandchildren are the most painful aspect of my new life. I miss them with a physical intensity that sometimes takes my breath away. But I also understand they are involuntary hostages in a war they didn't start and can't resolve. Their parents completely control their access to me, and have decided that my presence in their lives is conditional on my availability for unconditional family service. It's a high price for my freedom, but it's a price I have consciously decided to pay. Last week, something happened that confirmed I had made the right decisions. I was watering the plants in my small garden when I saw a family car coming up the gravel path. For a moment, my heart leaped, thinking it might be my children, finally coming to visit without a hidden agenda. But as the vehicle got closer, I recognized Carol, one of my sewing students, accompanied by an older woman I didn't know. "Evelyn," Carol said after we'd greeted each other, "I'd like you to meet my mother, Rose. She was just widowed and is going through a very difficult time with her children. I told her your story, and she wanted to meet you." Rose was 74, with perfectly white hair styled in an elegant bun, and that expression of silent defeat I recognized immediately because I had seen it in my own mirror for years. She told me her story as we had tea on the deck: a husband who had died leaving her with no financial resources of her own, 3 adult children who had begun to treat her as an inconvenient burden, a daughter-in-law who openly suggested it would be better for everyone if Rose moved into a nursing home to free up space in the family house. It was my own story, told in a different voice. I offered to let her stay in my guest room for a few weeks while she decided what to do with her life. I taught her basic sewing skills, introduced her to my group of friends in town, and showed her how she could create an independent source of income using skills she had developed over decades but had never valued as economically viable. 3 weeks later, Rose had rented a small apartment in town, had started teaching traditional American baking classes to tourists, and had set clear boundaries with her children about the terms on which she was willing to have a relationship with them. "You saved my life," she told me the day she moved into her new home. "I didn't know it was possible to start over at my age." That night, alone in my house that no longer felt lonely but peacefully inhabited by a woman who finally knew herself, I understood something fundamental. My story hadn't just been about my own liberation. It had also been about creating a model, an example, a living proof that it's never too late to choose dignity over comfort, self-respect over conditional love. Now, as I write these words in my journal, sitting on the deck overlooking the Atlantic under a starry sky that seems infinite, I realize that the last 6 months have been the most authentically mine of my entire adult life. I don't know if my children will ever understand that what I did was not abandonment, but self-love. I don't know if we will ever have the honest conversation that could heal the wounds we mutually created over decades of ill-defined roles and unexamined expectations. What I do know is that for the first time in 67 years, when I look in the mirror each morning, I like the woman I see reflected there. She is a woman who has learned the difference between loneliness and freedom, between unconditional love and unlimited service, between being a good mother and being an emotional martyr. She is a woman who has chosen to live on her own terms, whatever the cost. And that choice, however painful, has given me back something I thought was lost forever: the ability to respect myself. If you are listening to this story and something resonates in your heart, if you recognize in my words the echo of your own experience of being treated as an unpaid emotional employee by people who should value you, have you ever lived through a similar situation, or do you know someone who has? Tell me about it in the comments. And if this story has touched you in any way, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel. I need this message to reach someone who, like me a year ago, believes it's too late to choose their own dignity. It is never too late to start living on your own terms.